Right. Right.
Are you gonna take?
Really?
There's a lot of like different, like, I don't know. But I like.
Really?
That's kind of like this one. There's a lot of like, so.
Thank you. So really.
Yeah, I kind of don't belong in like this unit. So I'm kind of like, that's why like it was my fault. And I was studying last night. I was like, oh my gosh. So, and it's like, it's not, it's hard. Thank you. In my opinion. Also, I don't.
All right. How is a third of the class doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah. This has got to be the low of the semester so far. I'm trying to figure out why. Midterms? I don't think it's that they're just completely bored by the idea of listening to another lecture on markets. Well, thanks for coming. A couple things, sort of course-related stuff. Obviously, masks are now optional, and I just want to emphasize that that means optional. And so you cannot wear one, but you're also welcome to wear one. And we shouldn't be judging people one way or the other. And I am not going to wear one when I am teaching because I feel like there's enough distance. If you don't feel that way, then let me know. When I'm walking around and things like that, I will be wearing a mask. That's largely on the advice of my wife, who happens to work in the epidemiology department in the hospital. So for what it's worth, most of them think it's too soon. But I am excited to be able to talk without this mask. I'm a little bit mad at myself. I didn't shave off the full Grizzly Adams beard. I meant to actually trim it down a little bit before my face was visible. But I ran out of time. Anyhow, maybe next time I'll actually look more like a normal human being. Couple things with midterms, right? Grading there is ongoing. That's why I was recommending to people to wait until I send out an email that the grades are all done, so that you don't look at it and be like, I got a 50, because that's never pleasant. Even if you remember it 30 seconds later, that no, he said that this is only part of the thing. Even that momentary thought that you might have gotten a 50 will negatively affect the rest of your day. But they should be graded by the end of the week, I think, TK. And part of it's on me. I'm the one grading question number 3. So feel free to lay the blame there, although it's only been a week. Remember, paper drafts are due this Friday, unless you make different arrangements with your grader. Go drafts done over spring break. So just bear that in mind. You will get specific feedback on your exam once they're fully graded. So you'll see exactly where you missed points on each question. I will also post the answer template on Sakai, so you'll be able to see that as well. I feel like there's something else I'm forgetting. Any questions?
On the Sakai, the interesting places, there's like a midterm too, that's due tonight.
That's literally for one person.
Okay.
Yeah. You already took it? You're good. I forgot to plug this thing up. Any other questions? So today we're going to talk about some really basics of market theory. We'll be doing this today and Thursday. I don't know why I only gave myself a day on the syllabus to get through this and then market failures. So I will be making an adjustment there. But just know that today and Thursday we'll be talking about basic market theory. We might get into a little bit of market failures on Thursday. It just depends on how far we get today and on Thursday. And you get spring break very soon. So, before I start in, I know that most people in here have had at least Econ 101 or even the equivalent in high school. And there are lots of people who've had lots of econ. And so this is like a way back machine in lots of ways. A couple things I just want to point out. As we get more advanced in our studies, we actually tend to forget some of the basics, some of the fundamentals from the very beginning. So bear that in mind. And the other thing is we're going to be looking at things from a sort of a different point of view, right? Our emphasis here is from a policy lens. How can we use economic theory, market theory, to make people's lives better, to get people to change their behavior? What factors are important? And so it really is through that lens and not just a pure, theoretical model that's all pretty and stuff, because it's not pretty when it's applied. And so we'll start seeing where some problems with that model lie. You can start identifying them. We'll talk about some of them when we talk about behavioral economics and talk about others just kind of as we go through. But again, really thinking about it in terms of its relationship to policy and individual decision making. I hate it when it does this. It's not on. It's not on. All right. So here are some basic features of markets that everybody needs to remember. Here's the official definition, right? Collection of buyers and sellers that determine the price of a product or a set of products. Key words there is it's a collection. You need both buyers and sellers. You actually need certain amounts of both buyers and sellers. That it is their interaction that determines the price. It is not decided by a single individual somewhere. But the market itself, as a collection of individuals, this thing stopped working, that determines the price. Love these kind of days. When we're talking about them coming together, it is at a point where consumers are maximizing their utility and producers are maximizing their profit. And I'm aware that there are lots of producers who look at more than just profit, the whole triple bottom line thing. But in economic terms, like from a theory perspective, we're just sticking with the classic profit motive. Yeah. These are important, mutually beneficial. So that means satisfying Pareto. And they are voluntary transactions. If something that is not voluntary isn't going to be covered in the same manner by traditional economic theory as something that is voluntary. And we can obviously have lots of debates about what makes something voluntary versus involuntary and all that kind of thing, but that is a key distinction when it comes to the applicability of this particular set of assumptions and the like. Its core components work through supply and demand. There's a lot more to it than just supply and demand. Is that working now? No? Yes? That was really loud when I said no. Sorry about that. And we're going to go into details there. It is inherently a competitive model. And this is a very, very important feature of markets because it means lots of important things. One, you're competing against other buyers if you're a buyer. You're competing against other sellers if you're a seller. Right? It's not buyer versus seller. We are talking about individuals. So remember that economics treats groups as simply aggregates of individuals, and we pretend like groups are making an individual decision as opposed to a group decision. Both sides to a transaction are assumed to be price takers. It is the market itself that determines the price, right? It is that confluence of supply and demand that sets the price, and the buyers and the sellers just say, okay, well, that's the price. Do I want to buy at that price? Do I want to sell at that price? When we talk about self-interest or utility maximization, again, remember, utility is a broad concept. It's more than just money. There is a whole series of assumptions that in the pure model are very, very strict. And we've already talked about some of these, right? Like perfect information, perfect competition. And we'll talk about more as we go through. But these assumptions are necessary for the theory to hold and for us to be able to use it to predict behavioral changes. You know, how people respond to a policy change. And then people are making these decisions simultaneously. This is why we went through the whole strategic interaction stuff to get you thinking in those terms that in normal markets, the decisions are made simultaneously. Okay, there's some other kind of bigger picture features of markets that are just important to point out in terms of the overall policy environment that we are operating in, right? Markets, especially in this country and in lots of places in the world, but they really are seen as a driving force of progress, of innovation, of indeed making people's lives better. So when you have this underlying belief, right, that markets are good, then they become the default. Once they're the default, it becomes hard to justify tinkering with them. People get upset when you tinker with them. But hopefully you'll see by the end of this and the next lecture that there are lots of good reasons why we should tinker with them, and that those reasons can be purely economic in nature. If we were to regulate them, sort of the free marketeers hold, we're actually harming the market itself. We are dulling the mechanism by which they heal themselves, is what lots of people talk about. And this is, it's true, right? If there's somebody who is not a good producer of something, well, then they should go away, right? And econ and soc, like org theory, they actually talk about organizational births and deaths. Y'all ever encountered that before? I always find it somewhat weird. But the idea is, you know, if they're a crappy producer, they should die. That's the way the market heals itself. It allows somebody else to come in and take its place. And you may have been a little too young at the time, but hopefully you've heard something about it now, the 08, 09 recession. There is a lot of argument about this notion of banks in particular being too big to fail. That if we allowed these banks to go under, to die, that it would have just horrible effects on the economy as a whole. Now, market theory would tell you, no, they should go away. But in that situation, the government actually propped them up, allowed them to continue to exist. It wasn't just banks, it was also some automobile manufacturers. What do y'all call these things? There's little spiky balls on the ground. Nobody knows? No, the little spiky like orbs. Gumballs. That's what I always call them. And I said it the other day to somebody and they're like, what are you talking about? Anyway, this one just came out of my shoe. Okay. But there's also an argument to be made by the government stepping in and not allowing them to fail, that the market is actually worse than it would have been. You know, so this one's really important. Markets are amoral, not immoral, amoral. They just don't care, or more to the fact, right? Market theory is not equipped to deal with ethical equity questions. And this is a good quote from Whelan where he talks about the laws of physics. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but that is the level to which a lot of people take their adherence to market theory and market principles. And it's important to understand that markets, like, right, so people have a tendency to either just love markets and think we should do everything through markets, or hate them. Right? The truth is, they do a lot of good things. They do help us innovate. I mean, look at all of you with your Macs. You know, they do help us make our lives better, although I'm not sure Apple actually made our lives better overall. That could be a fun argument. But the other side of markets is that they're just mere existence. And more importantly, the mentality of the people who create markets, who believe that markets ought to exist, often make it hard to stop behavior that we want to stop. And so here you can think about black markets. That's what we call them. But the bottom line is, if there is a demand somewhere in a society that is driven by market beliefs, then somebody's going to come up with a supply. Right? Whether it's guns, drugs, whatever. You know, that demand will create supply. Supply will create demand, although most economists will not tell you that. I just think about Beanie Babies and Cabbage Patch Kids and things like that. But I was telling a story in the other class, like to me, one of the most interesting sort of black markets, otherwise known as smuggling operations in the United States, actually has to do with cigarettes. Anybody ever seen this, heard about this before? There's a huge cigarette smuggling, many operations in the US. And they do is they start in a place like North Carolina where we have low tobacco taxes, and they buy a whole bunch of cigarettes. And by a whole bunch, I mean like truckloads, like 18-wheeler trucks. And they drive them up to, say, New York City. And they sell them there for under market price in New York City, but that's like $5 more than they paid for them here. Incredibly profitable. Not that I'm saying you should do that. But in fact, a couple of years ago now, I guess it was, there were some agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that were busted because they had their own cigarette smuggling ring. And that was their job, was to stop it. But they saw how profitable it was, and they decided to do it themselves. Anywho, you learn something new every day.
I have a fun fact about smuggling if you're.
Oh, excellent. Smuggling fun fact.
Yeah. So during the Chechen War, like the first, second ones in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a huge smuggling ring for baby formula in the US. And the reason is because all the men were fighting, right? And it was a pretty like underdeveloped region. And so they didn't have access to like milk or like baby formula. And so people would buy it in bulk from the American South and then like ship it illegally, just like drugs or like guns, and ship it all the way to Chechnya and sell it there. And it was like a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, shipping baby formula, smuggling baby formula. Demand meets supply. Yeah. Baby formula is nasty stuff. I'm not saying I never gave it to my kids. I'm saying it tastes gross. Okay, so let's talk really simple supply, demand, making sure that everybody has the basics down. So, all right, this is the classic graph. Remember, this graph is of a particular good and really of a particular industry, right? The market for a particular good. You've got downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Where they meet, which I love in this graph, is purple, because red and blue make purple. Anyway, that's the equilibrium point. All right, so quantity star, price star, you might see Q, E, P, E. There's lots of different notations for it. The key is not to freak out when you see one of these things and just figure out where you're starting. Yep, and so this is where we're starting, where they meet. And this is the price that the market has determined that the buyer and the seller can choose whether or not to engage in the transaction at that price. And price really is the key. So I talked a little bit before about this assumption of perfect information. And market theory will tell you that price conveys everything that you need to know to make a rational decision. Now, whether or not that's true is often going to depend. Is it a perfectly competitive market? Are there other things involved? Is there other information asymmetry? But price is really the key. And it's the manipulation of price that we do to try to change behavior from a policy point of view. Yeah. So when you get a change in the price, you're going to get a change in something on here and probably go to some new equilibrium point. And remember, this is a snapshot. The markets are moving all the time. So this is just a snapshot in time. So want to differentiate between two different ways that demand and supply can change. And I'm going to talk about demand, and it's the exact same thing for supply. So I'll probably skip over that. But when there is some kind of change in price of a good or a service, right? I'm just going to use the word good. You get movement along the demand curve. And it's a curve, even though it's straight line. Okay. We call this a change in quantity demanded. Nothing's changing about the actual demand curve. It's just the quantity demanded is changing. Contrast that to when there is a change in the demand curve. We call that just a change in demand. Right? Demand itself has changed. So in this situation, it's probably something like they got more money. So increased income leads the demand curve to shift out. Get you in a second. So whenever it's going away from the origin, we call that shifting out or to the right, whichever one you want. And you get a new demand curve. Yeah.
So you were saying that from a policy perspective, we're mostly focused on like how we can change price. Would you say like policies such as like EBI would affect markets, and would that be a change in income? Well, it would be a change in income. But
Yeah, it would be a change. It would be a change in income, right? What it would do is it would shift the demand curve out for any given, good, and when it does that, it's going to change the price. Yeah. Okay. So on the supply side, it's the same thing, right? Change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. And so, let's say there is a change in demand, the demand curve shifts, you're then going to get a change at a minimum in the change in the quantity supplied. And you might get a change in both, like a change in demand and a responding change in supply. That we won't get that complicated in this class. I don't think. So here it is, again, just to illustrate it, we're starting here, Q1, P1, we get some kind of, let's just say again, income, demand shifts out, right? We end up at a new price, a new quantity, right? It's a higher price and a higher quantity that are being conveyed in the market. Don't ask me why that picture of that woman with a dress on there. I just thought it was really funny. I was looking at some other, like, it was literally like an econ book or something online, and they had that picture, and I was like, why? And then I decided, why not? But here, you're getting a new equilibrium at this higher price and higher quantity. All right, so let's talk about what actually can change supply and what can change demand. So we start getting at outside things, policy things that could switch. So start on the demand side. Income is probably the big one. Anytime you get a change in income, it's going to shift the overall demand curve. Your tastes and preferences. Right? One of the assumptions of the strict economic model is that our preferences are known and stable. And then they go and tell us, but changes in preferences can actually change the demand curve. And they can, in fact. So if you think about educational campaigns as a policy tool, that is often trying to get people to change their tastes and their preferences. Right? Water is really, really good. Soda is really bad. Something like that. prices of related goods, and we're going to talk about substitutes and complements later on, but that can have an impact on the demand, right? If I don't know, I guess if I was a big soda drinker and they put a big soda tax on there, the idea would be that I would reduce my demand for soda and maybe increase it for water, which doesn't work, by the way, as a substitute. Sugar is addictive. Anyway, other things that can happen, expectations, right? That seems kind of like, ooh, but expectations clearly can play a huge role in prices. How much does gas cost today?
$4.11.
$4 for 11. I heard $4.19 earlier. All right, but it's gone up a lot recently. Guess what? Our supply hasn't changed. That's all based on expectations. Expectations that supply might change. Uncertainty surrounding Ukraine and Russia and all of that stuff that's driving that change, right, in price. The number of buyers, remember this is based on the notion of competition. We need to have more than one buyer. We need to have more than one seller, right? If we only have one seller, that's a monopoly. If we only have one buyer, that's a monopsony. But either one of them can have a big impact on supply and demand, largely because if there's a few number of buyers, they might be able to set the price. And that leads to all kinds of other things that could potentially be bad from a policy point of view. So a while back, it turned out that McDonald's was like the only buyer of tomatoes. I believe it was in a certain place in Florida. Right, they got all of their tomatoes from this one place. So that place didn't have to sell it to anyone else. Well, then that meant that McDonald's got to set the price. Well, where are they going to set the price? Really low. What does that mean in terms of the people picking the tomatoes? It means they're going to get really bad wages and really bad working conditions, which is exactly what happened. Until finally, somebody stepped in. We saw the same thing, by the way. I think it was Walmart. It may have been tomatoes again in China. I'm trying to remember now. All I can think of right now is Mountain Olive pickles. Anybody like Mountain Olive pickles? One of the few examples ever of a customer boycott working. You're probably too young to remember this, but so it used to be that Mount Olive pickles on the corner of Cucumber Vine. Seriously, Mount Olive pickles headquarters is on the corner of Cucumber Street and Vine Street in Mount Olive, North Carolina. They got all their pickles from local farmers. Well, local farmers started demanding better working conditions, higher prices, that kind of thing. So Mount Olive said, okay, fine, we're going to buy all of our pickles from China. And then there was a huge boycott. And finally, Mount Olive Pickle said, fine. They stopped buying their pickles from China. They worked with the farmers, they compromised with them. So the good news is you can eat Mount Olive pickles without feeling guilty about it. Whereas I had years and years and years of agony. Also because I was a stockholder in Mount Olive pickles. My dad is from Mount Olive. For the record, I did not buy stocks in Mount Olive pickles. I inherited them. I'll stop talking about that. All right, let's talk about the supply side. There's lots of different things that could affect, like shift the supply. Could be some kind of input price. So if you go back to when the Trump administration had tariffs on steel and aluminum, That changed the input prices for a lot of industries, a lot of manufacturers in the United States, which then messed with the supply. We sometimes get new technology, new ways of producing things that might make it cheaper. It could be that some new way of producing stuff gets undermined by a lack of inputs. You can look at cars and computer chips and all that stuff that's going on today. Again, prices of other goods. The one that I want you to focus on right now is taxes and subsidies, because this isn't necessarily intuitive. But when we're looking at the effects of a tax or a subsidy on a particular good, okay, we do it through the lens of a shift in supply. So if we have a situation like this and we decide to put a tax on it, that's going to shift the supply in, right? And we end up with a new price and a new quantity, higher price, lower quantity demanded. But it taxes and subsidies actually shift the supply curve. So a subsidy would bring it this way. Again, expectations can be a big one, the number of sellers, and then supply shocks, which goes into sometimes expectations, exactly what we're experiencing right now, right? Because war is a supply shock. COVID has been a supply shock. And the mass resignations have been somewhat of a supply shock, such that, you know, you go into stores and there are certain things that they just don't have, right? How many of you have experienced this recently? Yeah. I mean, Food Lion for like a month didn't have Dr. Perky, which is Food Lion's version of Dr. Pepper, which if you've never had it is fantastic. It may even be better than Dr. Pepper. But I've gotten to the point now where when I go shopping, there'll be certain things that I can't find for like a month, 2 months. And then I find myself hoarding it, which then screws everybody else. But like I bought the last 3 things of gluten-free tortillas that they had yesterday. I bought their last 3 bottles of watermelon burst toothpaste, because oddly enough, that's what my wife likes to use. Okay. I've clearly gone into pure random land in my head. I need to rein it back in for a second. So let's look at a basic depiction of what would happen when we put a tax on. So this is a situation where we're assuming the market is in equilibrium. Right? It's different when the market is not in equilibrium and we put a tax on it to try to get it closer to efficiency. But we're starting here. We put a tax on it. Essentially what happens is the supply comes up here, right? We get a new price, a new quantity. But one of the things that we have to consider, right? I said that markets are amoral, that economic theory isn't equipped to deal with equity. Well, there are tools that we can use within it to measure potential inequity. So one of those is tax incidence. Right? When we put a tax on it, who bears the brunt of it? Is it consumers or is it suppliers? We're going to look at that in a minute. But you know, there are ways to look at that. The other thing I want you to recognize is what does this box represent? Anybody want to tell me?
Government revenue.
Government revenue. Right. So we always need to be concerned. Remember, we talked about taxes as having two purposes: changing behavior, raising revenue. So when you're looking at these graphs from a policy point of view, you always want to be looking at both of those things. So here is a graph that shows you how we sort of visualize the consumer's tax burden and the supplier's tax burden. It's called tax incidence. Oh, I had it on there. But you can see here, they're roughly equivalent. Consumers are paying a little bit more. Does anybody know what's going to determine who pays more? Yeah.
Which one's more inelastic?
Which one's more inelastic? The supply or the demand? Right. The relative elasticities is going to tell us who is going to bear the most of a tax. The one that is relatively more inelastic is going to bear more of that burden. All right, so I want you to talk with some people around you and just answer some fairly simple questions. I'll just give you a few minutes to talk, and then we'll regather and walk through it. But here's your question. Apple and Samsung and other phone manufacturers are having a hard time finding some kind of source for their phones. Ignore the fact that it says iPhones. That was just a mistake. So just like draw it out. What happens to the market for phones? Right? Is it still efficient? Right? Is it still at equilibrium? Why or why not? And then think about what happens if it's an element that only Apple uses, that Samsung and other Android phone makers don't use. So take maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene.
Probably keep
How is it gonna help me? Not to scare you, You have 4 years to try to get down. No, it is. Supply curve is just getting left.
Yeah. I think they had
You'd still be at equilibrium, though, that's the thing. You'd be at equilibrium. Equilibrium would just suck, but it's still efficient. Yeah, so, it's only inefficient if, it's only inefficient if supply and demand and price go up. So, only like. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness, I'm like, I missed
Oh my God. I would really, yeah. I don't know. I wasn't okay. So attention effect. Yeah. I think that
It's like, I can't remember, man. It's been like, it drops me. Yeah, so. And also, and then you get more. And then what comes after back was like at least for me, it was so hard. So would demand, or would demand consume some of the supply that first region serve demand? Or tend to the supply without happening. So as demand lowers. Don't try to visualize it in your drive.
Alright, we gotta figure it out, everybody.
So who wants to tell me what's gonna happen? here?
Like this morning,
This morning.
I think.
I'll
it
just
was
ask for
like an hour.
volunteers and then I'll just call on people. I'll call on people that give me the most evil eyes during class. Right, so the supply curve is gonna move to the left, right? So the price is gonna go up and the quantity is gonna go down. Okay, so is that efficient? I see both.
Yes, it's gonna be efficient because it's gonna be allocated, to people who are willing and able to pay a higher price.
Okay, so it's going to be allocated to people who are willing and able to pay at the higher price. Yeah, it's essentially establishing a new equilibrium. Right? And remember again, that markets aren't really static. They're going to be going back and forth, a little bit. Where a market is out of equilibrium, as you'll see when we talk about market failures, is when like the full cost schedule is not included. Like they're not including social costs, or they're not including social benefits, or something along those lines. But when the market moves according to some outside thing, it will create a new equilibrium. What if it's an element that only Apple uses? Yeah.
Demand would shift up for Samsung phones.
So demand why would demand shift for?
They're substitutes.
Okay, because maybe they're substitutes. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on that?
Just like gas, will the supply will still,
Supply will still move to the left.
because I think Apple occupies a large portion of.
Yeah, so she said that Apple occupies a large proportion of the market. So it's still going to have an effect on the whole market. Right? So what a question like that ought to sort of lead you to is, well, really there's two separate markets for phones. there's an Apple market and there's an everything else market. Right. And if you look at the corresponding supply and demand curves, especially the demand curves, you'll see that the demand curve for Apple looks very different than the demand curve for Android phones. Because there are so many different Android phones. And Apple users have this brand loyalty, right? That makes it more inelastic. So that wasn't really a question that you could answer. It was just something to get you kind of thinking a little bit. So another question I want you to talk about is this, and it's already outdated, even though I wrote it this morning. The U.S. has imposed a ban on U.S. Russian import. I don't even know what words just came out of my mouth. On Russian oil imports. What's going to be the effect, right? What maybe would you like to know to be able to answer this better? So just take a couple minutes and then we'll talk about it.
Oh my God. His name starts with a G. It's Gaston. Hold on, I'll turn it on.
It was so nice because I was looking at that. It was so low. So the place for like when you want to go like a price will go.
I know, I actually haven't seen them. I know, okay, you know what, I'm like, okay, Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians.
Because
No,
we were in the market.
Yeah. Like, so you don't even, we're not.
We're in someone who was
3% of our oil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't really remember.
I don't know.
It was so good, it was like a giant.
Yeah, it's part of the supply in the American.
It was
Like very.
But it's not.
Is the supply?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for perspective, so when
Alright, so
oil was at
this question
$48
isn't really all that different.
But it's a little bit more recent.
They just.
Who wants to tell us what's
threatened
going
to
on
make it 300.
or what's going to happen, right? Because we're in the
We'll see where it goes.
prediction mode.
I
Right?
wish I had a test for it about now.
Let's start more.
You done, Jay?
Sorry.
I thought I saw a hand sneak up. Okay, yeah.
Is that the quantity supply will decrease?
The quantity supplied will decrease
I mean, for the domestic. Okay.
for the domestic market.
Oh, that's just, that's right, like whether it is the whole market or the.
That's one of the questions you have to sort of like fundamental questions you have to ask at the beginning, right? Are we just talking about the US market? Or are we talking about the global market? Okay, that would be some helpful information for me to give you. And the reality is oil is a global market. Yeah. But what kind of impact might it have on US supplies if we think about it that way? So they might go down. What do we know about that? How much might they go down? I'm just curious to see if you read the news. Yes.
I heard like 10 to 20%.
10 to 20% of imports are Russian. It's not that high.
It's like 4 to 8%, right?
It's more like 5-ish percent. It's a fairly low number. Like we get does anybody know where we get most of our oil from? Canada. Like by a ginormous margin. So we get most of our oil from Canada. And then there's like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela. So, and Russia is like 7th or 8th on the list. So at least what I read, you know, will it have an impact? Marginally. You know, and not really enough to probably affect the price. Yeah.
But it also depends geographically in the United States where it like either like further on the West Coast near where Russia kind of is over there, or like where it would be.
Yeah, geographic location is going to be, you know, another factor in terms of the amount of supply and more particularly the price. Right? Because I talk about the market for oil being global, and it is. Right? You buy, you know, barrels of oil at a certain price that is a global market. But the market for gasoline is much more localized. You know, so that someone told me earlier that somewhere in California it's like $6.99 a gallon now. You know, which is big difference from here. And people were complaining about it, and I was like, go tell somebody from England that it only costs $6.97 a gallon. See what they say to you. $7 a liter, that's pretty good. No, I'm just kidding. I have no idea how much gas costs in England, but it's a lot more.
I would say the expectations might affect.
It's exactly right. Expectations might affect the demand side here. Right? If we have an expectation that there is going to be a low supply, or that prices are going to go up more and more, people might start hoarding, right? Like I did with the toothpaste. I don't think buying 3 tubes of toothpaste really can be considered hoarding. I don't know. Okay. So this next bit is really important from a policy point of view. And that's elasticity. Okay. So we're going to be talking about price elasticity. There's several different kinds of elasticity, but you can just assume the default in this class is price elasticity. And what elasticity is a measure of the degree to which consumption of a good will change in response to an increase or a change in the price of that good. Okay. You know, we can do it for demand, we can do it for supply, but like I said, we're mostly going to be focused on price elasticity of demand. And we generally calculate it looking at a 1% increase in price. What is the number that we get, right? What is the percentage change in demand for a 1% change in price? So here's the formula down here. You can see it's not that complicated, but I will say you will have to calculate it on a problem set. So now starts the second half of the semester when you actually have to do some math. You also see percentage change. Now you know why we went over that earlier in the semester. Because people calculate it incorrectly all the time. So you're going to get a number, and it can be any number. Generally, it's not like super high or super negative, but anything that is greater than 1 is deemed to be elastic, meaning that there's going to be a decent amount of change in the consumption when the price changes. Anything under 1 is considered inelastic. I don't care about unitary elasticity or any of that kind of stuff for fancy econ people. So here's an example for you. If this one is kind of dated. If the kit were to go from $2 to $3 or from $3 to $4, how much less will consumers buy? Somebody tell me why you're not answering.
It's probably gonna be around the same as gas.
Yeah, so that's a good point. It's probably going to be around the same. Notice how he didn't give me a number. But because gas in the short run is pretty inelastic, right? That's something that we know. But there's a good reason why he didn't give me a number. Why is that? Yeah, I didn't give you enough numbers to produce the key number. All I gave you was the price change, that you could calculate the percentage change in price, but we don't have the actual elasticity to calculate percentage change in demand. No. I don't know why I like to do that on questions, but apparently I do. It's getting people to read things critically and think about what other information you might need, I guess. So let's talk quickly about some things that can affect price elasticity, make something more or less elastic. The first one is simply the availability of substitutes, right? If there is another good that I can consume, that's going to make me roughly equally as happy, I'll just go do that. Anybody know what I mean by definition of the good? So yeah.
Is that like having to do with how narrow or broad like the market is? Basically, like it'll be narrow if you like Dr. Pepper, but it'll be broad if you soda.
Yeah, that's definitely one way of looking at it. So like it's how narrow or broad of the market you're looking at. Are you looking at Dr. Pepper or are you looking at soda? Are you looking at automobiles or are you looking at Toyota? Right, that's one way to look at it. Another way of looking at it is like, is it like a monopoly good? Is it a public good? You know, those types of things. But how you define the good is going to be important. Durability can be big. Because if it is something that is durable, right, you're not going to replace it as often. Y'all are too young to remember the days when actually we tended to repair things instead of just replace them. That was something decided, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago by various manufacturers that they're going to make it such a pain in the ass to repair things that it became almost cheaper to just replace them, especially things like washing machines, dishwashers, microwaves, Apple phones. Although now they're starting to cave. Apple is. Let you start repairing them. Income level is a pretty big one. Everything's gonna be more inelastic when you're richer, because you can still afford to buy it. Similarly, the proportion of the money spent on the good can have an impact as to how elastic it is. Here, I like to think about things like housing. Such a high proportion of what we spend that a slight change isn't going to affect whether or not we consume it. time. And here I'm really talking about short run versus long run. And lots of goods may be inelastic in the short run, but much more elastic in the long run. So if you think about plane tickets, you know, if I have to fly to San Francisco tomorrow, I have to fly tomorrow. If I just want to go visit San Francisco, and I don't no matter when, then I can wait and, you know, figure out, you know, when there's a good price, you know, and that kind of thing. That's why they can charge you so much for the last minute tickets. How many different ways you can use a good will make things more or less inelastic. So if you can use it for all kinds of different stuff, it actually makes it more inelastic. You're just going to keep on buying it. Necessities versus luxuries, that one's pretty clear. One that a lot of people don't really think about that much is addiction. Whether it's a physiological addiction to nicotine or alcohol or gambling, that's actually a physiological addiction as well. Or, you know, a behavioral addiction. All of those are going to have impacts on whether or not people change their behaviors in response to a price change. And then just the level of the price. Something that's like super cheap to start with, they would have to, like, you know, quadruple the price for people to stop buying. Okay, I actually want to look at some examples real fast. And then after that, maybe we'll pick up the rest next time. I will post this handout. I just forgot to post it before class. These are some estimates of some elasticities of demand. Okay.
That screen is not shared on Zoom.
Yes. So just take a look at what you can see right now. So all of these that you can see are in the realm of being inelastic. Anything strike you as particularly interesting? Yeah.
Fish.
Fish. And it's not just any fish. It's a specific kind of fish. What does that tell you? Anyone? Yeah, who eats a lot of cod? That's what they use to make fish and chips. Tells you that the authors of the study were probably British. And that the people that they interviewed and the data that they used is probably in England. Because cod certainly isn't inelastic in the United States. Anything else? I mean, a lot of it's like not all that surprising with salt and matches. I don't know why they did toothpicks. You know, like I said, airline travel short run, you know, is 0.1. Compare that to airline travel long run. All right. Right there, 2.4. That's a big difference. And then you start to see how some of those factors, right, that we just talked about, like the definition of the good, like narrow, like fresh green peas. Chevys. I don't know why they chose Chevrolet. You know, there's lots of things on here that I think would be interesting to reevaluate, because this is dated. You know, it's certainly, I mean, it's from a while ago, 95, 97. I'd be curious to see about restaurant meals today, right? Or, you know, the fish consumed at home there. I wonder if that's become even like more, as people finally figured out how to make their own fish and chips. It's not that hard. Anyway, I find this kind of thing interesting. Hopefully some of you do too. You can go home and you can share it with your roommates. Hey, did you know that fresh tomatoes are really, really elastic? You know why? Because we have canned tomatoes. I'm a little bit shocked by some. I mean, some of them I'm just like, why are you measuring it? But like oysters consumed at home, I feel like that should be much more elastic. But I guess if you really like oysters. All right. It's 3:12. We'll pick up here on Thursday. I want y'all in like one more slide after this. There's another activity. I want you to go ahead and look at those before we come into class on Thursday, and we'll talk about them, you know, then. But in that way, we can just kind of move straight into consumers and producers. All right. Well, thanks again for coming, and I'll see you Thursday. What do we identify? It didn't cross my mind.
No, they do.
I just pretended like
We were doing it for somebody. It was really sad. I said when they were talking, yeah, look at your report.